Late spring drifted across the valley like a whispered hymn, warm enough to soften the earth, yet cool enough to keep the morning breath of the mountains upon the grass. The wind moved slow that day, brushing lightly over the untamed acres of Elias Crowell's land, stirring the tall yellow reeds like fingers through an old violin's strings. The land carried stories, some forgotten, some half-buried, some waiting for someone patient enough to hear them. Elias was not searching for a story. He believed his life settled long ago into quiet patterns. But the land had its own plans. It always did. He rode alone as he often did, his broad hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much silence in recent years. Wealth hung around him like an unspoken truth, stitched not in gold but in the certainty of a man who owned thousands of acres and yet still felt like a guest upon them. Money was never the measure of Elias. Loss had shaped him far more deeply. The folks in town whispered about the wife he had buried too young, the laughter that once lived in him, the way grief made a man both gentle and unreachable. His horse slowed as they reached the far edge of his property, where cottonwoods bent over a narrow creek and an old, crooked cabin leaned against time itself. It had always stood empty in his memory, abandoned, skeletal, a place claimed only by the wind. But today, smoke rose from its chimney in the thinnest gray ribbon. Elias reined in, brow tightening. Someone was living inside it. Someone quiet enough that no one in town had mentioned a thing. He lifted his gaze, studying the cabin from a distance. A faint flutter of fabric, a curtain, carefully mended, shifted in the window. The door had been repaired recently. Fresh-cut cedar boards sealed a crack along the frame. Someone with skilled hands lived there. Someone who touched broken things gently. Elias dismounted, boots sinking softly into the spring-wet soil. He took a few steps, stopping before he reached the path leading to the porch. He wasn't a man who liked to intrude. But the land was his, and duty tugged at him even when curiosity tempted him more. Then he saw her. She stepped outside with a small wooden bucket cradled against her hip, her black hair braided loosely over one shoulder, the late morning light making the strands glow like ink warmed by fire. She was slender, yet her posture held endurance rather than fragility. Her face carried the tired grace of someone who had learned to survive by staying quiet. She moved with deliberation, each gesture soft, controlled, respectful of the earth beneath her feet. Elias recognized that kind of quiet. It was the quiet of someone who had been spoken over for far too long. She did not see him at first. Her focus stayed on the herbs she had hung beneath the porch beam, little green bundles tied with twine. Their scent drifted faintly across the creek. Mint, sage, something floral he couldn't name. Only when she lifted her head toward the water did her eyes catch the outline of a man watching. Their gazes met across a distance that felt larger than the field between them. She did not flinch. She did not greet him. Her expression remained still, steady, unreadable. Elias felt a small pinch in his chest, the kind that came when something gently challenged the quiet he had wrapped around himself for years. He tipped his hat in a subtle nod. A courtesy, nothing more. She didn't return it, though her hands tightened slightly on the bucket, the only sign she was wary of strangers. And why wouldn't she be? A woman alone in a broken cabin. A woman who looked different from everyone for miles in every direction. A woman who had chosen invisibility as her shield. He wanted to say something simple. "You're safe, I'm just passing through," but he remembered how words could sometimes make silence heavier instead of lighter. So he stepped back, giving her the space she held onto like armor. She disappeared inside the cabin without a sound. Elias remained a moment longer, listening to the soft trickle of the creek and the whisper of cottonwood leaves. Something about the scene unsettled him. Not in fear, but in a quiet knowing. Someone living in that cabin meant someone was hiding, or someone had been pushed to the edge of the world until the only shelter left was a forgotten place no one claimed. He mounted his horse again, yet he didn't ride away immediately. His gaze swept the land around the cabin, the small vegetable patch carved into the soil, the neat stack of firewood, the way the windowsill had been cleaned. Whoever she was, she had taken the ruin and made it an offering to her own survival. It stirred something in him, something like recognition, though he had no right to feel it. He finally turned his horse, guiding it back toward the main trail. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders as he rode, but the image of the woman did not leave him. It settled into his thoughts with a weight that felt strangely familiar. People like her didn't end up in forgotten places without a reason. And if the town had noticed, they would have spoken. They always spoke. By the time Elias reached the rise overlooking the valley, he slowed again. From here, the cabin was no more than a small shadow tucked beneath the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney once more, a thin, persistent line, as though the fire inside refused to die no matter how cold the world outside had been. Elias watched that smoke far longer than he intended. The land around him stretched peacefully, but something in the air felt unsettled, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. The woman in the cabin was not simply living quietly. She was hiding something, or someone was looking for her. And though Elias had not spoken a word to her, nor she to him, he felt the pull of a story already beginning, one that would soon turn strangers into something far more complicated. As he rode away, a figure stepped from behind the far-off ridge, watching the cabin with an interest far colder than Elias's. The man's stance held greed, not concern. And Elias did not yet know that this stranger's shadow was about to fall across both their lives. Word traveled slowly in late spring, moving across the valley in the same wandering rhythm as dust along a wagon trail. It sometimes arrived as a whisper in Mrs. Holloway's general store, sometimes as a half-hidden smirk outside the saloon, sometimes as a question no one dared ask directly. But by the time a week had passed after Elias Crowell spotted smoke curling from the old cedar cabin, the town already carried an opinion about the woman who lived there, though none of them had seen her long enough to know the truth of her name. They called her the foreign girl, the quiet one, the mystery on Crowell land. Folks often feared what they never tried to understand, and fear always wore the face of judgment. Mrs. Holloway, kind-eyed and weary from years behind her counter, listened without adding her voice. She remembered a time when people had spoken the same way about newcomers from the east, the north, even neighboring counties. But judgment was stubborn, and the world moved slower to kindness than she wished it would. Elias stepped into her store that afternoon for spare nails and feed. He rarely lingered anywhere long, but that day he paused, feeling the subtle current of conversations shifting as he entered. Men leaned on barrels. Women pretended to examine cloth. Something unspoken hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. Mrs. Holloway nodded toward him, her voice low. She said the cabin had gained a tenant, and the town was deciding what to think of it. Elias felt the familiar tug of irritation, not anger, but the ache of seeing how quickly people built walls around what they did not know. He kept his voice calm as he asked if anyone had spoken to her. No, Mrs. Holloway said softly. Not a soul. Elias carried his purchases to the counter, the wood creaking beneath his boots. He did not like how the town watched him, as though waiting for his opinion to shape theirs. His land made him influential, though he never sought the burden that came with it. Mrs. Holloway added a small cloth pouch to his supplies, herbs with delicate fragrance. Perhaps she'll need these, she said quietly. Elias did not ask how she knew he intended to ride that way again. Meanwhile, on the far end of town, Caleb Hargreaves leaned against the rail of the livery, his eyes sharp with calculation. He had heard the rumors too, and unlike the others, he saw opportunity where they saw curiosity. An unclaimed tenant meant a legal question, and legal questions often led to land disputes. Caleb had long been waiting for the chance to pressure Elias into selling part of the valley, a slice he believed could serve his expanding trade routes. If a woman lived in the old cabin without permission, then Caleb could stir enough trouble to make Elias choose between peace and property. He saddled his horse with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Caleb was a man who liked easy victories, especially when they came at the expense of someone who had never bowed to him. Elias Crowell was respected in ways Caleb could never buy, and that envy hardened into something bitter. Lynn May knew nothing of these conversations. She spent her days tending a small garden behind the cabin, her hands steady as she placed seeds in soil softened by spring rain. She repaired cracks in the windows, scrubbed the floors, and made the place breathe again. Survival had taught her the rhythm of silent work. She asked for nothing, expected nothing. The world had already taken more from her than she ever dared speak aloud. Yet she felt the shift in the air, the way the wind sometimes carries the sense of being observed. At night, shadows stretched differently across the field. She would pause, hand hovering over a wooden bowl or the little fire she kept alive, wondering if the loneliness around her was beginning to change shape. She remembered other places where men had tried to uproot her life, their eyes cold, their words sharp. She prayed the valley was not the same. One evening, while she washed herbs by the stream, she heard hooves along the ridge. Her breath tightened for a moment, though she kept her expression still. A rider paused, just long enough to watch the cabin from above. She could not see the man clearly, only the outline of someone studying her home with a hunger she recognized too well. She lowered her gaze, pretending not to notice. Fear did not show on her face, but it rippled in her heartbeat like a drum sounding beneath still water. Elias returned to the cabin the next morning, keeping a careful distance. He did not want to frighten her or appear to claim authority. He placed the herbs Mrs. Holloway had given him on a flat stone near the creek, then stepped back. Lin May emerged moments later, seeing the small offering. Her gaze lifted to him, sharp but not unkind. She studied him as one studies weather, gauging whether he was a passing storm or a steady sky. He spoke softly, letting the words fall like river stones. No demands. No questions. Only acknowledgement that she was there and he did not intend harm. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture neither acceptance nor refusal, simply recognition that he had spoken to her as a human being instead of a problem. A faint movement on the ridge caught Elias's eye then. He turned sharply, catching the silhouette of a rider before it vanished behind the trees. Lin May followed his gaze, her breath shifting, just enough for Elias to see worry flicker across her expression. She gripped the herbs he had brought, though her knuckles paled with tension. Elias felt something in that moment, an unspoken plea, or perhaps a warning. The presence on the ridge was not accidental. Someone was circling her life with intention. Someone who had already decided she did not belong. And as the wind changed, carrying the scent of distant dust and growing conflict, Elias realized that whatever quiet existed between them was about to unravel into something deeper, more dangerous, and inescapably intertwined. For the stranger on the ridge had not ridden away. He was waiting for nightfall. Morning crept gently over the valley, its pale gold light folding itself across the fields as though the land were being tucked beneath a warm quilt. Elias Crowell rode slower than usual, not because his horse was tired, but because his thoughts were tangled enough to slow the rhythm of his hands. He hadn't slept well. The image of the shadowed rider on the ridge kept returning to him, circling his mind like a restless hawk. He told himself it wasn't his concern, yet concern had already rooted itself inside him, uninvited but undeniably present. He guided his horse along the creek's edge, letting the soft murmur of water settle him. When the old cabin came into view, he noticed something different. A small lantern burned beside the doorway even though the sun had risen. A cautious choice. A quiet signal. Lin May had likely kept it lit through the night. Whether out of fear or vigilance, he couldn't tell, but the small flame felt like a whispered cry. Someone was watching. Lin May stepped outside moments later, her expression composed, though her movements carried a weight she couldn't fully hide. She held a wooden bowl in her hands, its rim chipped but polished clean. She didn't startle when she saw him approaching. Perhaps she had expected him. Perhaps she had hoped he would come. He stopped a respectful distance from her, dismounted slowly, and let the silence stretch until it softened between them. She looked at him the way a person studies weather, measuring, interpreting, preparing. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, held more stories than she would ever willingly speak aloud. He knew better than to pry. Pain, when forced into words too soon, often broke instead of healed. He offered a small bundle he had tied to his saddle. Cloth, dried beans, a little flour. Essentials. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would make her feel beholden. She hesitated, fingers curling lightly around the wooden bowl as if weighing not the gift but the intention behind it. When she reached out to accept it, her touch brushed his briefly, not long enough to call it a moment, but enough for Elias to feel a shift inside himself, subtle yet undeniable. Lin May set the supplies beside the cabin wall, bowing her head in acknowledgement. Her voice finally rose, quiet as a reed bending in wind. Her accent held the cadence of distant shores. She thanked him not with flattery or obligation, but with sincerity shaped by resilience. Elias listened with a stillness that surprised even him. He hadn't realized how long it had been since someone spoke to him without expecting something in return. She motioned gently toward the damaged fence near the creek. One post leaned heavily, worn by years of weather. Her meaning was clear: she would not ask for help, but she would not refuse it if it was freely given. Elias nodded once, rolled up his sleeves, and set to work repairing it. The rhythmic sound of hammering filled the morning, slow and steady, blending with the creek's steady hum. Lin May returned to her gardening, kneeling in the earth with practiced grace, her movements silent yet purposeful. They worked without conversation, but their silence was not empty. It carried a quiet understanding neither had fully recognized until now. Elias found his thoughts wandering less toward worry and more toward the woman who had survived so much with so little witness. He wondered how many miles she had crossed, how many nights she had slept in fear, how many times she had rebuilt herself after the world crumbled beneath her feet. At midday, she approached with a small cup of tea, fragrant with herbs. She handed it to him with both hands, a gesture of respect he did not take lightly. He accepted it, feeling the warmth seep into his palms. She didn't sit beside him, but she stood near enough for him to sense the tentative trust emerging between them. As he drank, Lin May spoke of her garden, the way certain herbs healed wounds, the way others soothed restless hearts. Her words were few, but each carried intention. She did not speak of her past. She did not mention the rider. Yet beneath the gentleness of her tone lay a thin thread of guardedness, as though every sentence had been sifted for what could be safely revealed. Elias found himself wanting to protect the delicate peace she was trying to build, even though he knew peace was rarely welcome in a world sharpened by greed. When she stepped away to gather more herbs, he watched her move with the quiet dignity of someone who had been overlooked too many times to rely on kindness, yet still chose to cultivate beauty where she could. As he finished the fence repair, the distant rhythm of hooves reached them, slow and deliberate. Elias's spine stiffened. Lin May froze mid-step, the basket in her hands trembling slightly. The sound grew closer, echoing through the hollow like a warning carried on wind. Caleb Hargreaves appeared between the trees, his posture brimming with insolence masked as confidence. His horse kicked up dust as he reined it in, a smirk settling across his face. He looked at the cabin, the garden, the freshly mended fence. Then he looked at Elias, calculating. Elias felt Lin May's fear settle over the air like a fragile shroud. She moved behind him instinctively, though she kept her expression unreadable. Caleb dismounted with a thud and approached the property line, eyes gleaming with ambition. He said the cabin was sitting on disputed land. He said a stranger living there without permission could cost Elias ownership rights. He said the law favored the bold, and he intended to use it. Every word dripped with false courtesy and veiled threat. Elias stepped forward, calm but unmovable. He told Caleb the land was not his to covet. Caleb laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that made Lin May's hands tighten around her basket. Elias refused to give him the reaction he wanted. But inside, a quiet storm began to rise. Caleb mounted again, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a promise that he would return with the law at his side. Lin May stood still long after he disappeared, her breath shallow, her gaze drifting toward the ridge as though expecting danger to reappear any moment. Elias turned to her, the valley suddenly feeling smaller, more fragile. His voice softened. He told her she wasn't alone in this. For the first time, fear flickered into something else, something like fragile hope. But before either of them could speak further, a second shadow appeared on the ridge behind the cabin, watching them with an interest that chilled the warm spring air. The days that followed unfolded with a tension so quiet it almost disguised itself as peace, the kind that presses softly against the ribs until breathing feels uncertain. Elias Crowell rode to the cabin each morning with the steadiness of a man who had chosen a side long before admitting it aloud. Lin May received him with the same gentle composure, but something in her eyes shifted each time she glanced toward the ridge. Fear had a way of marking the air, faint as smoke yet unmistakable to anyone who knew how to read it. Elias repaired the cabin's shutters, tightened the hinges, cleared brush from the path. These were ordinary tasks, yet each one carried a promise he did not voice. He sensed that Lin May, though quiet, understood. She brewed tea for him, placed small bundles of herbs at the edge of his saddle, and offered faint, fleeting smiles that softened the edges of her guardedness. Trust formed between them like the slow weaving of a basket, thin reed by thin reed, patient and sure. But the valley itself felt unsettled. Birds quieted earlier than usual. Horses at Elias's ranch snorted at dusk, restless as though catching scent of something unwelcome. And on the third evening, Thomas Reed, Elias's foreman, rode to him with questions etched deeply into his brow. He spoke of Caleb Hargreaves visiting town officials, stirring arguments wrapped in legal terms that held the shape of weapons. He said the rider on the ridge had been seen again, watching the cabin for hours at a time. He said Elias needed to be careful, that stepping into this conflict meant more than his land. It meant his reputation, his business, perhaps even his safety. Elias listened with patient calm, though a quiet fire lit itself beneath his ribs. He had lived through loss, through grief's heavy winter. Danger did not frighten him as much as the thought of someone vulnerable being left alone in its path. He told Thomas he would handle it. Thomas shook his head, knowing too well that Elias often carried burdens silently until they bled into his bones. The next morning, Elias found Lynn May tending to her garden, but her movements were different, slower, weighed with thought. The herbs in her hands trembled slightly. When she raised her gaze to him, it was not fear he saw, but exhaustion. A life spent surviving left marks that no scars could show. She spoke more words that day than before, her voice soft but unbroken. She told him she had lived in many places where she had been asked to move, told to leave, warned she was unwanted. Each time, she rebuilt herself quietly somewhere else. The cabin wasn't perfect, but it held a stillness that had allowed her to breathe for the first time in months. She didn't want to lose it. She didn't want to run again. Elias felt a swell in his chest, an ache, a resolve, something between sorrow and promise. He told her the land was his. No one had the right to cast her out. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he saw the pain flicker in her eyes. Ownership meant nothing in a world where envy disguised itself as law. Before he could say more, the crunch of approaching hooves stiffened the air. Caleb emerged from the trees with two men beside him, Jeremiah Slate, a deputy known for leaning on technicalities, and a surveyor carrying rolled parchment under one arm. The three dismounted as though arriving for a negotiation, but the tension in their shoulders betrayed different intentions. Caleb tipped his hat with mock courtesy, his smile thin and sharp. He announced that they had come to resolve the matter of occupancy. He spoke of land rights, of unauthorized dwellings, of county regulations he barely understood but wielded with confidence. Each word was coated in the arrogance of someone who believed that legality and righteousness were the same thing. Elias stepped between Lynn May and the men, his stance steady as the cottonwoods behind him. He asked what claim Caleb believed he had. Caleb gestured to the surveyor, who unrolled the parchment with exaggerated flourish. Lines and numbers sprawled across it, a map meant to intimidate rather than inform. He said the cabin sat close enough to disputed boundary that questions had arisen, questions he was generously helping the county address. Lynn May's breath hitched, but she did not move. Elias felt her stillness like a presence against his back, a quiet plea, a reminder of what was at stake. He told Caleb the land had belonged to his family for decades. Caleb smirked, arguing that boundaries could shift with age, with erosion, with oversight. Deputy Slate nodded, offering half-mumbled legal jargon that sounded convincing if one didn't know the truth. Elias knew. He asked calmly what Caleb wanted. Caleb's eyes gleamed with triumph, mistaking silence for surrender. He said the woman could remain only if Elias ceded a portion of land to settle the alleged discrepancy. A trade. A threat dressed as compromise. The valley held its breath. Elias stepped closer, his voice low but unshakable. He said no land would be traded, no woman displaced, no scheme tolerated. Caleb's smile faltered. Deputy Slate shifted uneasily. The surveyor looked suddenly too small for his own boots. Caleb's eyes hardened. He warned Elias that refusing would escalate the conflict. He hinted that others might become involved, men far less polite than him, men who would not bother with laws or maps. Lynn May's hands tightened around her sleeve, though she kept her gaze steady. Elias did not raise his voice. He simply said that anyone threatening her would have to go through him and that he did not scare easily. Silence thickened like evening fog. Caleb mounted again, but before riding off, he leaned forward, pointing toward the ridge. He said someone else had as much interest in the cabin as he did, Someone who had been watching long before Elias ever noticed. He didn't name the person. He didn't need to. The warning curled through the air like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Caleb and his men rode away, leaving dust hanging like unsettled judgment. Lin May exhaled only when the last hoofbeat faded. Elias looked toward the ridge, where a darker shadow now lingered with unmistakable intent. The rider was no longer merely watching. He was waiting for his moment to step out of the trees and claim whatever he believed was his. Night fell with a weight that felt older than the valley itself, a dark quilt stitched with quiet warnings. The cabin lantern flickered like a fragile heartbeat in the distance, its glow too small against the approaching shadows. Elias Crowell stood beside the porch, scanning the tree line with a stillness that came from long-practiced vigilance. He wasn't a man given to fear, but tonight carried a different kind of silence, one shaped by intention. Lin May stood just inside the doorway, her hands resting lightly on the frame, fingers pale against the wood. She watched Elias the way a person watches the horizon before a long storm, measuring the danger, measuring the man who chose to face it beside her. She said nothing, but her presence at his back steadied something in him, as though she had quietly stepped into the space where loneliness once lived. The rider appeared at last, emerging from the shadows with the slow confidence of a predator who believed the night belonged to him. He came alone, though the certainty in his posture suggested he didn't need company to make himself dangerous. Elias recognized him from stories. Jonas Merritt, a man who drifted through counties like smoke, taking what wasn't his and slipping away before the law caught breath enough to chase him. Jonas stopped several yards from the cabin, his horse pawing at the ground as though impatient to be freed. He stared at Elias with dull amusement, then shifted his gaze to the doorway where Lin May stood. She stiffened. The fear in her eyes wasn't the startled kind, it was the remembering kind. Elias felt her breath hitch from across the porch, and something inside him hardened. Jonas dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, circling his horse as if giving Elias time to evaluate him, time to understand that he had come not out of curiosity or mischief, but claim. Elias stepped forward, body angled enough to shield Lin May from view. Jonas chuckled at the gesture, as though kindness were an old joke he'd forgotten the punchline to. He said the woman belonged to him, voice slick with entitlement. He said she had escaped months ago, taking nothing but the trouble she carried. He said someone like her had no business starting a new life in a cabin that didn't belong to her. His words crawled across the air like oil on water, staining everything they touched. Lin May shook her head behind Elias, trembling but resolute. She didn't speak, but Jonas's name on the wind seemed to strip color from her face. Elias didn't need more explanation. He felt the truth of her fear, felt the years of exploitation Jonas hinted at with casual cruelty. He was a man who turned people into possessions, and the thought of Lin May being treated as such stirred a quiet fire in Elias that no wind could tame. Elias told Jonas she wasn't going anywhere. The cabin was safe ground. The land was his. Jonas laughed again, louder this time, a sound that broke awkwardly through the stillness. He said law meant nothing when men like him decided their own rules. He stepped closer, boots sinking into the soft earth, eyes glinting with the thrill of a challenge. Elias didn't move. His calm felt sharper than any weapon. Years of grief had carved him into a man without fear of pain, without dread of standing alone. Jonas misread the silence as weakness. He lunged forward, reaching for Lin May with a hand trained to take what it wanted. Elias intercepted him with the force of a man whose restraint had finally run out. The impact sent both men stumbling, boots scraping against earth. Jonas swung, but Elias dodged with steady precision, planting himself between Jonas and the doorway. The fight wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was the collision of two worlds, one that believed in dominance, and one that believed in dignity. Jonas recovered quickly, anger twisting his face. He drew a knife from his belt, its blade catching the lantern's faint light. Lin May gasped. Elias's shoulders tightened, not in fear but in recognition of the line Jonas had chosen to cross. Violence was easy. Protecting someone without losing your humanity was harder. Jonas lunged again. Elias sidestepped, grabbed Jonas's arm, twisted until the knife clattered onto the ground. Jonas cursed, swinging wildly. Elias pushed him back, breath steady, eyes unwavering. Jonas stumbled, humiliated more than hurt. This wasn't the victory he expected. Men like him fed on control, and Elias's refusal to break under his rage unsettled him. He spat dirt from his mouth, angling his glare toward Lin Mei. Pain flickered through her expression, old wounds rising like ghosts. Elias stepped closer to Jonas, voice low, steady as riverstone. He said no man owned her. He said she chose her own path now. And he said if Jonas took one more step toward the cabin, the valley would bury the consequences. Jonas's bravado cracked, fissures spreading through the mask he wore. He glanced at the ridge as though expecting Caleb or someone else to intervene, but the night answered with silence. The valley belonged to Elias, and no law, real or twisted, would shield a man like Jonas here. Realizing the tide had turned, Jonas retrieved his knife, mounted his horse, and spat a final threat into the dirt. Not today, he snarled. But soon. He rode off into the darkness, swallowed by the ridge he once believed gave him power. The silence that followed felt different, not heavy, but cleansing. Elias turned to see Lin Mei leaning against the doorway, tears glistening along her lower lashes like dew on petals. She wasn't crying from fear alone. She was crying because someone had stood for her without demanding anything in return. Elias stepped closer, stopping just near enough for her to feel the steadiness of him. She whispered a soft thank you, voice trembling like a fragile thread woven into something new. He shook his head gently, telling her she didn't owe him gratitude, only the promise that she would never again face danger thinking she was alone. A breath passed between them, warm and uncertain. The lantern flickered. The valley exhaled. And just as Lin Mei lifted her gaze with something like hope, Thomas Reed rode into view, his expression grave, his horse lathered with sweat. He called Elias's name, voice tight with urgency. Caleb hadn't given up. He had brought the law with him, and they were coming before sunrise.